Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I'm usually here on Sunday mornings, like all you brave people, listening to wonderful presentations, and I don't think I can entertain you or inform you as much as many of the other speakers have, but I'll try my best. As you will have gathered, there's a Unesco connection. Well, I worked at Unesco until 2002, and I had various positions, quite senior positions in the culture department. And Galia, who's my wife, stayed in UNESCO much longer than I did, and she had even more senior positions in UNESCO when she retired. We're now spending half of the time here in Goa and the rest of the time where we live in Europe, which is Paris. And when I left UNESCO in 2002, I kind of reinvented myself as partly an academic, which is why you see my presentation on a university template. I also have become a sort of internationally active cultural policy expert. Right now I'm doing some work for the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. I'm doing some work for UNESCO. I have worked for the European Commission, and that's the sort of thing that I do. And it's quite varied. The topics that I research or study or write about or talk about are quite varied. For example, here is a volume. This is the 5th volume of a series of books that I co-edited with a German partner who is Professor Helmut Anheier, a well-known German sociologist. And it's a series called Cultures and Globalization, and this is a volume, the last volume in the series, called Cities, Cultural Policy and Governance. And if there's anybody who's interested in this kind of thing, please ask me. This copy is for you. But today's topic is different. Today's topic is the topic of cultural diplomacy. And I was fortunate a few years ago to have been the team leader, the scientific coordinator, if you like, for a big EU project with a kind of clumsy title, Preparatory Action, Culture in EU External Relations, that was coordinated, in fact, by the Goethe Institute, together with the Institut Français, the British Council, and a number of other European bodies, to look at Europe's cultural relationships with the rest of the world. And I also had the chance to be the author of a report that was part of the general report, which is an India country report. And it's that research which kind of enabled me to have a perspective on the way in which cultural diplomacy is carried out officially by the Indian government agencies who are responsible for that, and I'll come to that in a second. And this illustration is of a volume that appeared just this year. It was based on a special issue of the International Journal of Cultural Policy, and it was a series of essays looking at how cultural diplomacy might be stretched beyond the very utilitarian ways in which it is used, and I'll be coming to the ways in which it is used in non-utilitarian ways by Indians and Indian agencies. So that's a bit of the background to this. I should mention also that this is the website of a European platform organization called Culture Action Europe, which is mainly cultural activists. It's like a big NGO working at the European level. And so my work was not just theory or research or being an academic. I was the president of this organization for 4 years. So I had to do a lot of lobbying also for culture on the European scene. So what I'm going to share with you this morning is what you see on the slide here. I'm going to talk about some terms which have become leading international buzzwords. They're used a lot. They're not really that much used in India, but they're used very much in the United States. In fact, all 3 of these terms are American inventions. They're used widely in Europe. They're used widely in East Asia. If you go to China, you go to Singapore, you go to Hong Kong, you go to even Korea, all of this language will be used. India has a different vocabulary even for talking about these things. And that vocabulary is kind of, if you like, mediated mainly through the work of a body called the Indian Council for Cultural Relations, and I'll come to that in a minute. And what is special? There are 3 things that are special. India does it differently. That was the title of my talk. The first thing is the way in which the work of the official government bodies is less instrumental. It's less target-oriented than in most other countries today. The second distinctive thing is that the Indian diaspora plays a huge role in all of this, a much larger role than for any other country in the world, including China, where there's been a long tradition of relationship with the diaspora. And what has now happened in the last few years, basically since the liberalization of the Indian economy in 1991, but much more so since the BJP governments have been in power, there is a new discourse which is a projection of India and a projection of global Indians, which kind of downplays the cultural component. It's much more a neoliberal capitalist sort of discourse. And I'll come to that. That's the last part of my talk this morning. As I proceed, please, if any of you have any doubts or questions, don't hesitate to interrupt. I'm not sure if that suits the film gang as much as it would, but we'll deal with that as we go along. So, just to give you a couple of slides here on when people talk about cultural diplomacy, what's going on? And here are two slides which are taken from the French. Since I'm a French national and live in France, it was appropriate that I should find something that teams France with India. And this is an initiative that many of you may have been involved with called Bonjour India, a festival of France in India, where the French government put in place a whole series of events to project a certain image of France in India. And that projection was very much based on objectives like developing markets, doing deals with Indian businesses, selling warplanes, ammunition, you name it. Now what's interesting, and that's coming back to the core of my talk, is that the term itself, cultural diplomacy, has become very, very central in foreign policy practice. I mean, very soon, if you are with, let's say, German policymakers, they will talk about cultural foreign policy. I forget the term in German, but there is one that's used very much. Same thing in Britain, same thing in the United States, same thing in France. It's also a term that is used more and more, again, not so much in India, but more and more in Europe and the United States, for when cultural activists, artists, theater people want to work with people in other countries. And I'll explain why they're using this term. It's a fashionable term. It's a term that brings in the support, it brings in the recognition. And as in most countries of the world, the cultural sector has become very, very central. And you know that even politicians, even hard-headed politicians, pay a lot of attention to it. It's a situation in which cultural operators, and that term cultural operators is a European Union word to try and talk about not just artists and people like Subodh, but also people who are doing the organizing, people who are running associations, who are running theater companies. They are also the cultural operators. And so everybody, wants to believe that they're doing cultural diplomacy, but actually there's a lot of fuzziness in the way the term is used. Not a lot of clarity on what exactly it involves, why it's important, and how it works. There's a lot of faith that goes into into cultural diplomacy, that we're doing this and it's going to pay off. It's going to bring us contracts, it's going to bring us friendship, it's going to bring us security. And this confusion is mainly because there are two terms that are getting mixed up all the time. There's this newer term, cultural diplomacy, which was invented by an American diplomat exactly in 1959. In English it wasn't used before that, but I believe in French it was maybe 30, 40 years ago. So you've got cultural diplomacy, which is something that states do. It's states doing this in their own interest to influence other states, other governments. And then you have cultural relations. And let's say the work of MOG, working with partners in other parts of the world. I don't think it would come naturally to Subodh to say, I'm doing cultural diplomacy, but it would come naturally to him to say, we are doing cultural relations. And it's generally people in the art sector, the culture sector, non-state actors who practice cultural relations rather than cultural diplomacy. And a retired American diplomat, Richard Arndt, who wrote a wonderful book called the first resort of kings, American cultural diplomacy in the 20th century, actually made the distinction that I've just made, but he made it better than I did. Cultural relations that grow naturally and organically without government intervention, and cultural diplomacy that can only be said to take place when formal diplomats try to shape and channel this natural flow to advance national interests. And as I said, this distinction has become increasingly blurred. And because of this blurring, you have now what's come as the official definition of cultural diplomacy. If you Google cultural diplomacy, probably the first thing you'll find is that line: the exchange of ideas, information, art, and other aspects of culture among nations and their peoples in order to foster mutual understanding. This is real sort of state rhetoric. And the real purpose is not mutual understanding. That's not why they're doing it. The true protagonists are never abstract nations or peoples. It's governmental agents, governmental envoys. And so what's really at stake is how can we use culture? How can we play the cultural card to our own benefit? And I come back to a point I made briefly earlier, but I think it merits repetition, that this expediency isn't why artists and other cultural workers actually want to work across frontiers. They want to work across frontiers for what's in that second bullet point. Mainly artistic cooperation, the creation of new artistic works. That's what you want to do if you're working with an artist from another country. But talking the talk of cultural diplomacy brings in the cash for sure, and perhaps it makes artists feel more important, because there's always been this relationship between art and power, between the poet, the painter, and the filmmaker, and the summit of power. And although most artists will say they don't really believe in it, a lot of it is kind of double talk. They really like to feel that they're doing something important. The second term that has now become very current, again, not so current in India, is soft power. Again, coined by an American, this time an academic, Joseph Nye at the Kennedy School of Government. And what Nye was getting at, as he was a political scientist who was often advising the US government, he's Democrat, so he was advising mainly Democratic administrations. He began to say to the American government is, look, we've got this huge command power. We have all of these sticks. We have our military power. We have our economic power. But that's not going to get us anywhere if we want to get others to want what we want, if we want to get others to share our own preferences. And this term, soft power, which, remember, is being used to advise the government of an extremely strong hard power country, it's not supposed to be applied to a country which has no hard power. It's supposed to be applied to a country which has a lot of hard power. And the guy is saying, look, it's not just the hard power that's going to get us where we want. We need to have soft power, a combination of hard power and soft power. But that distinction has been lost. And I just want to share with you the philosophy that Nye sets out in his initial article that set the ball rolling. The power that comes from setting the agenda, determining the framework of a debate. The ability to establish preferences tends to be associated with intangible power resources such as culture, ideology, and institutions. And so the idea is you deploy American soft power alongside, not instead of, its hard power. And American soft power is, of course, the universal appeal of American popular culture, which Hollywood has always worked hand in hand with the US State Department and US Department of Commerce. And it's also the ethnic openness of its way of life, which is now kind of threatened by the ideas of Donald Trump. And it's also the political appeal of the American values, its value-based democracy and human rights, that we all think all over the world are good things. However, as I said, there's not much use of the term in India, except in the speeches and writings of Shashi Tharoor. And this extract is taken from a brilliant TED talk that he gave in 2010, where he sets out why Indians should pursue soft power. And India is and must remain the land of the better story. Better than whom? Better than the Chinese, of course. That was his strapline. Stereotypes are changing. We've gone from the image of a land of fakirs lying on nails and snake charmers to computer wizards, software gurus, and so on. But there's something more substantive, political pluralism. And that's the platform, of course, on which Shashi Tharoor bases his own belief system. So that lets me go on to that notion of a broader kind of discourse, a broader kind of relationship, allows me to go on to the third buzzword that is being used. So you'll often see people talking about cultural diplomacy, public diplomacy, soft power. Public diplomacy is kind of an overarching category. Cultural diplomacy fits into it. And public diplomacy is about building relationships, not so much with governments as with audiences and publics. It's a process that has to involve civil society organizations and or private sector stakeholders. So it's much more citizen-oriented. It's a form of intercultural dialogue that's based on these sorts of values, mutuality and reciprocal listening. So to take an example once again, you'll have many countries, let's say Western Europe, who would look at an institution like MOG and say, you know, we would like to farm out some kind of an exchange program to you. We don't want to do it ourselves. You do it so much better. You have all the contacts. You can reach out to the people. You speak the language. But will it happen in India? No, of course not, because the way the Indian polity works is different. But I do have an Indian example of public diplomacy to share with you in a second. Just to give you an example of what public diplomacy is, this is the fact that in 2013, the first year of its involvement, Angola won the Venice Biennale's Gold Lion Award for the best national participation. And one of the world's leading specialists in public diplomacy, Nicholas Cull at the University of Southern California, that's what he says. This was brilliantly perceived. It's the emergence of newer voices with something important to say. And the point that he's making, it wasn't Babus who decided on the Angola Pavilion. It was a bunch of artists who got together. It was curators, and they did something wonderful. Now, in India, a few years ago, there was a very dynamic individual called Navdeep Suri, who kind of shook up completely a small unit in the Ministry of External Affairs, which is called the Public Diplomacy Unit. Since Navdeep Suri has left, I've tried to relate to them and get them to tell me what they're doing, and the short answer is basically nothing. But while Suri was here, before he went off to be ambassador, I think, in Australia, he was doing this program, which is called the Public Diplomacy Program of the Ministry of External Affairs. And here are two examples of the kind of thing that the ministry through this unit was funding. Getting young Africans to participate in the Jagriti train yatra, or this India Future of Change initiative, which was based on design contests, which were India specific. And they reached out to universities and design schools all over the world. So I'm going to move on now to the Indian exception. I've shared with you cultural diplomacy, soft power, public diplomacy, what these terms are. And before I move on, is there anybody who would like me to clarify anything, questions? No, so I will move on and just remind you of my initial message that the practice of cultural diplomacy in India is very clearly rooted in a kind of cultural pride that began to emerge in the Bengali Renaissance of the late 19th century. And there's a very distinguished Indian political scientist called Partha Chatterjee in a book called India and Its Fragments, where he lays out very clearly that throughout the colonial experience, starting with the 19th century, the cultural domain was like a domain of sovereignty in which Indians felt very secure. The Westerners, the British colonialists, couldn't get to that. That was our thing, our customs, our culture, our habits. And along with that, there was the idea that can be taken to absurd lengths, of course, but the idea that there was something very wonderful in Indian culture, that there was something very unique to be shared with the world in the nature of India's intellectual and cultural past. And that is something that allows me to use this word cultural noblesse oblige. Unlike many other countries, except my country of citizenship, which is France, where the French certainly believe that they have something to share with the rest of the world and the rest of the world will benefit, India does as well. So here you have an interesting parallel. The second point is the central role of the Indian diaspora. And then the last thing that's happening, which is kind of a new trend that is not duplicated anywhere else, is the new neoliberal avatar of the global Indian. So the Indian exception, cultural relations instead of cultural diplomacy, is basically embodied in an institution called the ICCR, Indian Council for Cultural Relations. But what's interesting is that it's the very first of the apex institutions. It was created before the Sahitya Academy, before the Lalit Kala Academy, before any of those apex institutions in Delhi were created. It was created expressly on the behest of Jawaharlal Nehru, and it was created in the Education Ministry under the aegis of a very distinguished Indian statesman, Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad, who was the first Minister of Education of the Republic. And there is no other country in the world that has such a visible and prestigious agency devoted to cultural relations. I think if you Google, you won't find that word used by any other foreign ministry in the same way. And the core purposes of this body were again defined in very idealistic terms by Jawaharlal Nehru himself. And it was clearly better understanding between our peoples and the peoples of other countries. There's a slight matlab, if you like, in this first sentence, not only with the neighboring countries to the east and west, because there what Nehru was thinking about was the Indian cultural and intellectual influence, and he said, that's something we've got to build on, but basically it was an idealistic, non-instrumental approach. And what you find is that except for the festivals of India, which were really the brainchild of Indira Gandhi, who was an extremely savvy and cunning, as you know, politician, and had a very clear sense of how she wanted to change the image of India in the rest of the world, Indian cultural diplomacy, certainly the way the ICCR has worked, has been pretty non-instrumental. It's pretty much the language of exchange, mutuality, rather than even thinking about soft power. Although, of course, soft power wasn't a term invented, but you could have seen words being used that really meant that, but you don't. And many observers, for this reason, many European or American academics will tell you that yes, the way India does this is very old-fashioned. That's certainly an opinion of Shashi Tharoor's, where in his book Pax Indica he says, "Look, guys, we've got so much we can build on. Let's do it." But despite the fact that I've said that this was a very visible and prestigious institution, it's never had big funding. There's a little bit of a contradiction there. It's something like $47 million, that's its annual budget. I was working on this for a European and American audience, that's why I've got it in dollars. And if you just look at the objectives very quickly, this is kind of bureaucratic language, so I won't linger, but those two bolded points, that's really what the ICCR is about. And that's the website of the ICCR, and this is a recent capture. There's a World Sanskrit Conference, which of course language, Hindi, Sanskrit has always been part of the ICCR's activities, but you can imagine that under the present administration it's even more of a priority. But, and I'll come to that at the end, there hasn't been much shift in the way the government looks at the work of the ICCR. The programs of the ICCR are all of these things, which I'm not really going to unpack because my purpose here isn't to give you a detailed expose on the ICCR as such. But what I've done is I've highlighted in red the three elements which indicate this very, very clear focus of the Indian diaspora. And it's very clear that these activities form a cluster that's unique in its intensity. Admittedly, nowadays, diasporas are becoming much more important in international relations. But in no other country is it quite like the way it was in India, where the centers, the ICCR centers abroad, that is, centers where India is saying, we want to show ourselves to you. It's not in Washington, it's not in Berlin, it's not in Paris, where there are a lot of people who don't know anything about India. It's where there are sizable Indian communities. So basically what you're doing is you're saying we want to reach out to our own people. We want to provide a service to our own people there. So those are some of the very significant figures. And then if you look at the list of all the centers that exist abroad, you get that pattern coming up. You see that it's Kabul is a neighboring country, Suva and Lautoka are in Fiji, big Indian population, Georgetown, Guyana, big Indian population, Jakarta and Denpasar less now, but quite a lot, and Bali is the Hindu background. I won't linger on that, I think the point is clear. So what we're seeing here is that in the work of the ICCR, which again is really practically the only governmental agency that does cultural diplomacy, the diaspora dominates. It's as if India is wanting to project itself abroad and talk primarily to a segment of itself that is kind of a co-producer, a co-beneficiary of all of the events that are held. And no other country, as I've said, except the Chinese, has this close link with its diaspora. And the way the Chinese government talks to its diaspora is quite different. They don't focus on culture at all, but on much more practical things. And this was something that emerged even before independence, where the diaspora was seen as a kind of responsibility. It's an attribute of India's international persona, if you like. Even the British colonial administration was led to intervene, and the plight of this first wave of the Indian diaspora, which is basically indentured labor in the 19th century, these people were already then identified in a very real sense of being Indians abroad. And this is an extract from a nationalist writing. I couldn't find exactly where it was, but it's very significant. They constitute little bits of India and take to the lands where they live the culture and the religion, the traditions and the ways of their great motherland. Neither the passage of centuries, nor in some cases the complete break with the past, has made them forget the glory that was India. Language that you see coming out very strongly nowadays. Things change a little bit with independence, where Nehru is extremely conscious of the fact that Indians who are settled abroad are citizens of other countries. And so he's very insistent, don't demand special privileges, we're not going to deal with you in any special way. You've got to be good citizens wherever you live. And that's something that as early as 1927, Nehru has elaborated. Now in all this, because we're talking about the arts and culture, the arts and culture are really only a small part of the activities of the ICCR. The main things are the centers abroad, the chairs of Indian studies. The educational component is much bigger than the cultural component. Yet when you think of the ICCR, already in its name, Indian Council for Cultural Relations, people think of the arts. And that's where the ICCR is the most severely criticized. And those critiques, as I said, I'm not here to give a critique or analysis of the ICCR, are generic. They apply to anything government does in this country: bureaucratic inefficiency, nepotism, cronyism. What's important is that the ICCR is very much a kind of high culture canon. Bharatanatyam, Kuchipudi, Kathakali, all things which are fine in themselves, but Tritha, who galvanized us a couple of weeks ago here, she would never get impaneled by the ICCR. In fact, I looked just the other day when I was preparing this, and out of something like 180 or more impaneled artists, or maybe even more than that, only about 10 of them are contemporary. And of the contemporary ones, the only one I recognized was Astad Debu, who's a dancer in Bombay, and he's now a very senior person. He's my age, and but the rest were unknowns. And the rest were all sort of really traditional people. And there's obviously no projection, and this again is different if you look at the way France does it, or the way Britain does it, or the way Germany does it. They're very much into the most vibrant example of contemporary culture. Not India, and no promotion of Bollywood whatsoever. No engagement with the huge soft power potential that Bollywood represents. It's Delhi-centric. That's been another critique that's come out often in Parliament. And the curious thing has happened, that is that the ICCR, in responding to this critique, has created centers, many regional centers in India. But what happens with the regional centers, just as it happens in Delhi also at Azad Bhavan, is that it's Indian artists who are being presented for Indian audiences. And I've always wondered what the sense was of having the Indian Council for Cultural Relations presenting Indian work to Indian audiences. There is some foreign work that comes in, but it's really not the majority. So I'll come now to the last segment of my talk, which is to look at how a shift has occurred in the last few years, basically since Narendra Modi was elected. And that shift is a kind of change of discourse in the way that India uses or doesn't use culture to project itself internationally. The entire diaspora is very layered. There are very poor people. There are people who live in the most difficult conditions. Think of labor in the Gulf and so on. But they're all now being swept into the maw of the global Indian, to come back to your question. Because the Indian state is very actively driving a relationship, a different kind of relationship, between the nation and its domestic abroad. And that domestic abroad is a term used by an Indian scholar in the US, Lata Varadarajan. And it's happening in other countries, but her book is based mainly on what's happening in India. As global Indian businessmen become agents of the globalizing Indian economy. There is something called the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, which means the gathering of overseas Indians, which was started by the UDA government NPA government in 2003. I actually attended the first Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, and there were a few people around who were, Amartya Sen was there, Bhikhu Parikh was there, but the majority was businessmen. And in 2004, the second Bharatiya Pravasi Divas, Bajpayee, Atal Bihari Bajpayee, the then Prime Minister, gives this speech, and where he says, last year we had a wonderful Jugalbandi between Pandit Ravi Shankar and Pandit Bismillah Khan. They played together. Jugalbandi is a term when two musicians play, and it means sort of entwined twins. And he's using this image of the Jugalbandi to say the relationship between the Bharatvasis, those who reside in India, and the Bharatvanshis, those who hail from India. They don't live in India, they're from India, and they're bringing together the dream of shining India. Didn't pay off for them, of course, the slogan of shining India, but you know what shining India actually is supposed to mean. And Arun Puri, writing in the India Today, a special issue on the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas in January 2004, he sort of gives the whole range of overseas Indians. He includes white-collar techies, he includes the Patels in the US motel industry, but the last sentence is the key, is the will to succeed, and that is right at the heart of the liberal capitalist ideology that he's plugging. So this reference to the spirit of capitalism is far from accidental. The interests of the corporate segment of the Indian diaspora and the nation's interests have clearly converged, and the diaspora has become a natural and essential part of India's future progress. That's clear, should be clear to any political leader, and Modi has understood this much better than any of his predecessors. And just for your I just wanted to give you the source of some of these ideas. Lata Varadarajan, the domestic abroad, diasporas in international relations. It's mainly about the Indian diaspora. And this is my last slide, where I share with you the fact that Narendra Modi is now vigorously promoting this figure of the global Indian. He is reaching out far more to the diaspora than any of his predecessors ever did, but it's hardly at all in cultural terms. There will be some perfunctory reference to Swami Vivekananda, a few other things, but he basically doesn't really care much about the cultural card. Cultural relations are but a minor card in this global strategy. And so the ICCR is being left largely to its own devices. Now, this might be a good thing because it's actually run by a senior diplomat. So somebody who's kind of ambassadorial rank gets made the director of the ICCR, the director general of the ICCR. And the chair is somebody who is respected by the regime. It happens to be a Sanskrit scholar and historian, very distinguished in his own field, called Lokesh Chandra, who replaced Dr. Karan Singh, who was, of course, a very cosmopolitan internationalist. And so what we see here is that, fortunately, so far, the ICCR is not being too much interfered with by the current administration, which, as you know, is moving in to establish a sort of a hegemony in many of the other cultural institutions. And with that, I have finished. If anybody wants to get in touch with me afterwards to ask me questions, I'm on Gmail, yrisar@gmail.com. Thank you very much for being such good listeners.
You mentioned ICCR.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned soft power. Now, ICCR, I would like to understand a little bit more. Now, you mentioned Venice Biennale, where Angola
Right.
got the best stall. Now, so far, India has not had any pavilion in Venice Biennale. The only time this happened was when Ashok Vajpayee was the
Right.
at Lalit Kala Academy, and he somehow managed to have
Mhm.
at least Indian participation,
Right,
official
right.
Indian participation. After that, it has never
Mm.
happened. Why is that so? Why ICCR cannot take initiative to sort of participate, for example, in Venice Biennale?
I think probably because that's a pretty big budgetary implication. There was a scandal a few years ago where the US administration said we can't afford it. And they tried in America to raise money for an American pavilion, and they weren't able to. So if in the US they can refuse to do this, think of the chunk that would represent in the ICCR's budget. And the ICCR has become what in French we call a fromage. It's like a cake that's being cut into by a whole bunch of artists, people who are friends with the government, with the director, with the minister. And it's a closed circle. And the money is really there to be spent on sending these people abroad, getting them trips abroad. And don't forget that the cultural element is not a huge part of the budget. I don't have the exact figures, but most of the money is being spent on the centers and on the chairs. So
they also pay the students. For example,
yes.
There are so many African students in
Absolutely.
who get money from ICCR.
Absolutely. I didn't dwell on that. That's a very good point, but I didn't dwell on that. And that's also something that's kind of peculiar almost to India, is that most of the thrust of the ICCR is actually educational. And you wouldn't find any other body in the world, other than the British Council perhaps, which is very hooked on language teaching English abroad. But most of the other countries, when they have a cultural diplomacy body, they don't deal with education. They do education, they do have scholarships, but it's another ministry, it's another sector. In India, it's the same. And so the bulk of the spending, if you go back to the slide, I can do that, and the list of what they actually do, the student scholarships is a big part of that.
And mostly the scholarships are not for Indian students, but students from
Yes.
other countries
Yeah.
who study in India.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a certain appropriate.
Criterion for choosing these students? On what basis do they get the scholarship?
I don't know, but I'm sure there are fairly elaborate. The site of the ICCR would give you the answer to that. There must be a fairly elaborate application process that's involved. This is not something that I actually, looked at myself.
No, there should be some cultural input from that side for ICCR to pay for their education here.
No, I
They
do
should
not
also
know.
benefit.
But the only thing I would say that the curatorial or there is no proper curatorial thing when they send somebody. If you have some connections, you get sent. And it happened with me. I was once sent, but this was just for one small speech I made for Mr. Karan Singh.
So you had a question?
Yeah, I'm coming back to the soft power issue.
Yeah.
You mentioned Joseph Nye.
Right.
And in fact, I remember in the 80s, 90s, when the Japanese were taking over the world, and now it's the Chinese.
Yeah.
He said, we were talking about the downfall of the United
Mhm.
States, and he then said, don't you underestimate the soft power of America. The music, the
Sure.
movies, the whatever.
Absolutely,
You know,
yeah.
Softest is
soft
in
power.
the Mac, the softest.
Exactly, and they produce every day new
Yeah, yeah,
products.
yeah.
Now look at the Chinese, look at the Japanese. What have they besides sushi and karaoke?
Right.
And very little. Russia has no soft power
And that's
whatsoever.
Tharoor's
Now
point.
the question to India.
Yeah.
What the hell is your soft power? You have image problem abroad.
Mhm.
Women get raped. Corruption country. War at the border with Pakistan. Now let me please tell me what are the
Right.
soft power arguments? Is it good enough to have a yoga world day, as Modi has declared, or what can India actually offer? The glory of India.
It's along those lines. If you look at the branding campaign, Incredible India, which I didn't touch upon because that's nation branding, there's a whole set of things. Or if you look at the extravaganza that was put on in Davos a few years ago by the Indian delegation, it's selling a dream. It's the dream of exotic India, Maharaja's palaces, houseboats,
Maybe
and
going back to the fakir.
yeah, absolutely.
I mean,
Absolutely.
ultimately,
And what
that is-
Tharoor was trying to do as a politician, as somebody ideologically committed, say that no, it's the model, our open society model. But it's very difficult to defend that open society discourse when you see what's going on and how people are getting killed and oppressed every day. So your point is very well taken.
I must have also mentioned it's also the curry. It's curry whoosh.
Right.
Now that you have experienced, whether it's
Mhm.
cultural relations or diplomacy, in different administration, I mean, where do you think it's going in the future of India being projected on a cultural basis, especially with the fact that now it's more of the corporate Indian projection, say 5-10 years from now, where do you see this going?
Well, I think what the younger generation is doing independently through social media and so on, the millennials that Elvina referred to, it's too early to tell, and I haven't studied that. So it's a great project. So maybe your comment is going to lead me to start researching this thing. Certainly, I don't see any change likely to come about through governmental channels. I don't think the ICCR is going to have its budget tripled. I don't think any minister of culture is going to say to them, look, in any case, it's the foreign minister who determines. So I don't see Sushma Swaraj turning around and saying to the ICCR, look, you've got to present India's contemporary culture. You've got to think of the completely different, revise the line completely, go back to the drawing board. That's what you'd need to do. And that said, a lot of these things are very good. Bringing the students, that was the number one thing on the list of programs. The biggest head of expenditure is the students who are being brought in. Now, if you bring African students in and they get subject to terrible racial discrimination in the cities, you're shooting yourself in the foot. And this has been going on now for many, many years. But then there are other students who are brought from other areas who probably have they don't have that problem, and they probably have a good time. So it is creating goodwill. You have a whole generation of leaders in Africa who have all been students in India. They have mixed memories, but they are all fairly positive about India because of that. They certainly didn't go to Pakistan. They certainly didn't go to China. They came to India because of the language, because of the educational system, and so on.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Subodh. It's always a pleasure to be at the Sunday MOGs, the MOG Sunday mornings. And once again, thank you for giving up your morning.